The humid air of the late afternoon hung heavy, clinging to everything like a damp cloth. It was the kind of day that made even the simplest tasks feel arduous. Inside Larry's local, the familiar, slightly musty aroma of hardware and household supplies filled the space, usually offering a comforting sense of small-town normalcy. But today, the usual placidity felt brittle, the air charged with an invisible tension. The man we'll call John, with his short-cropped, thinning gray hair and ruddy complexion, was standing in the plumbing aisle, scowling at a shelf stocked with copper pipes. John wasn't having a good day. The dishwasher was still leaking, his car needed new brakes, and his neighbor's dog had barked nonstop since 5 a.m. A general sense of being besieged had been brewing since he had gotten out of bed, a bitter, rising frustration that he didn't seem to know what to do with. His clothes, a worn, slightly faded work shirt and denim jeans, hung loosely on his frame, adding to the impression of unease. Across the aisle, standing before the gardening tools, stood a man named David. His posture was erect, his shoulders square, as if molded by years of discipline. The uniform tan of his skin contrasted sharply with the bright yellow of the rake he was contemplating. A subtle but firm pride could be read in his gaze. A small USMC logo could be seen on the sleeve of his plain blue t-shirt, that paired with his sturdy combat boots and a noticeable purple heart medal attached to a simple silver chain, could imply what a respectable part of the community David is. David reached up and adjusted his black frame glasses, the movement unhurried. The store was nearly empty, and aside from the occasional shuffling from the worker stocking shelves in aisle 6, the ambiance was of a lazy and quiet weekday. He paused, glancing out a large storefront window, his attention snagged by a low cloud bank building on the horizon. He took a step, placing a single item into his cart and pulling up the corner of his mouth in a quiet grin, before focusing once again back at the section in front of him. As he bent forward to examine a pair of pruning shears, his attention was diverted by the rhythmic squeaking of John's rubber sole. He noticed the furrowed brow of a stranger, but quickly turned his attention away, not looking for a confrontation with someone who already looks aggravated. John, who had moved closer, was mumbling to himself. A combination of profanity and unintelligible frustration danced from his pursed lips as he continued to pick up various connectors from the shelves and then promptly placing them back. "Piece of junk never works," John grumbled as he slammed the last connector back onto the shelves before angrily pulling up another piece. David tried to move around as quickly as he could, but unfortunately needed to pass close by to examine a hose splitter for one of his friends who was incapable of making these types of movements himself. The clatter of the metal pipes echoed in the store when David made the unintentional collision of shopping carts as they pass. John let out an exaggerated sigh that could easily be picked up by everyone within hearing distance of it. "Excuse me," David said evenly, his tone measured but laced with the quiet confidence of someone who has been tested by hardship and come out strong from the experience. John turned towards him, a barely hidden aggression gleaming in his gaze. It was as if the minor disturbance was just the spark needed to ignite his previously simmering anger. His face seemed to have hardened by the movement of his body that he used as the turning point for where his gaze was then focusing. "You need to pay more attention where you're going," he snapped. His voice was rough, gravelly, and tinged with a hint of barely restrained violence. It caught David slightly off guard, who expected to be greeted by indifference at best, and most probably even a mutual glance between a passing stranger. "It was an accident," David replied, "but I am sorry." He tried to make eye contact with the other man in a gesture of calm sincerity. This, instead of appeasing the man, was instead received with contempt. He quickly redirected his gaze and turned away, mumbling something incoherently. He had clearly expected some pushback from the stranger and felt robbed of the opportunity to go even further, and this quickly soured his already bitter mood even further than before. He didn't appear to register David's apology. Instead, he crossed his arms and stared hard at the shelf, as if blaming it for his misfortune. "This entire store is run by morons. Can't even put a couple pipes together." He turned and fixed his gaze onto the side of David's head. David turned his head so that the two of them now had the opportunity to see each other in the face. David tilted his head forward with a confused gaze. John kept glaring and began to speak again. "Oh, I didn't see you over there. What have we here, a mister?" "Fancy pants. Must be someone important since they can't walk straight. His words dripped with sarcasm as they echoed off the shelf dividers. It was clear the statement he made was only intended for maximum hurt potential. David was a lot more shocked at this turn than before. He did not come across to others in any kind of way that could elicit such an aggressive attack as he had just received, and so was slightly confused. Is there something else? David asked, his voice neutral as a last effort of an attempt at de-escalating the situation. Yeah, there is. What you see is my country, not yours. He raised an accusatory finger toward David's face, his features contorted into a mask of anger. Go back where you came from. Your people don't belong here. David was taken aback not because of the verbal assault itself. He has experienced that in many other instances. But this particular verbal outburst felt so much more charged than before. His face turned passive once again with a faint air of calm concern towards what has suddenly unfolded. This is my country, David responded calmly, keeping his voice level, but not at all devoid of anger. The anger within him simmered just underneath the surface, ready to erupt if anything else was thrown his way. His dark eyes reflected the overhead fluorescent lighting. John, sensing that the attempt at verbal and mental bullying did not immediately do its intended job, turned a darker shade of red. His posture now shifted in that he seemed to slightly crouch with a very aggressive stance, reminiscent of an animal looking at its next victim. You can say what you like, you don't know anything. His hands now gripped into tight balls at the side of his body. He began to come at David once more. I do, he started again, this time speaking calmly and slowly, so to emphasize and not be misinterpreted by the older man standing before him. I actually have served it as well. He turned slightly in the torso, allowing John the chance to look again at the Purple Heart. The contrast in the mood he was currently exhibiting compared to before had John slightly stunned. But even that wasn't nearly enough to bring his aggressive nature under any control at this point. I'm sure you think you know something. The things you and your kind have done here over the years. His voice continued with an angry spatter, but this time much louder, more enraged than ever. The quietness of the hardware store was completely overtaken with the booming yells, catching even the workers off guard who had begun glancing towards the direction the sounds originated from. The mention of your kind was clearly aimed as another attempt at demeaning the character and status of the person John was addressing. There is still the confusion surrounding exactly why these personal attacks were happening, but the underlying racial tones are obvious. This seemed to trigger the quiet and simmering anger to finally erupt from David. He clenched his jaw, but even this seemed unable to extinguish the burning feelings he had. His fists also tightened. The other worker from aisle 6 hurried around a corner with concerned wide eyes before finally taking the steps toward the direction of the raised voices. She took up her radio and asked if someone needed to report to aisle 4 due to possible situation involving aggressive patrons and customers. John ignored this change. He has grown used to being confronted as of late in regards to various different actions, but the nature of them made no dent in his decision or thought process. You think I don't know you? The government thinks you all should be out to pasture now. So why the hell are you still out of the stable, doing whatever this thing you are trying to pull? He went to continue this. His voice was slightly quivering from the combination of all of the emotional outburst he has had. It sounded desperate, and as it intensified, there came across a slight tinge of vulnerability, which very quickly once again morphed into raw fury. I just hope and pray I get to see the day this kind of thing has finished. David felt the anger flare, hot and insistent, but just slightly held back from making anything else that may cause problems. His mind tried to grasp the randomness and the illogical statements John continued to unleash at him. It felt as though the years of being a trained officer has been severely challenged by the man before him, all due to random feelings that could not be deciphered. It seemed that each attempt at understanding were only leading into an increasingly painful and very complex situation that offered very little benefit of solving this misunderstanding that was currently playing out before them. His eyes searched John's face, and he attempted to understand exactly the origins and nature of this random attack. John seemed completely irrational, but something stopped David from unleashing his fury. Some part of him still maintained enough awareness of where they were, of the setting and surrounding public, that prevented his response to become equally loud. There was something deeper at play, an understanding, however small, that John was acting irrationally, and no amount of anger could change or shift what is already cemented within him. He glanced slightly at the employee, whom now slowly crept closer toward the commotion. This seemed to give an extra pause for David's next action. However this may go, he had to be slightly more level and reasonable, or this entire encounter was about to take a turn towards something even more aggressive than a verbal rant. "There are a lot of ways we can do better," David stated quietly, his voice low as his gaze stayed directly fixated into the eyes of the man yelling at him. He slowly extended his hand, almost hesitantly, as his fingers extended the slightest of gaps from the palms of his hand. He could feel every cell in his body yelling and wanting more, each tendon wanting more energy to feed from. He didn't back down from his initial idea. His stance, even at such an emotionally complex time, did not change one single degree, not even a tremor. His gaze remained the same even with the aggressive glares now thrown directly in his face from John. John hesitated at this gesture, staring down at the outstretched hand for what felt like an eternity before finally taking an action. John hesitated at the gesture, staring down at the outstretched hand for what felt like an eternity. His eyes darted back to David's face, confusion battling with the ingrained fury that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. He seemed almost bewildered, a corner of the rage faltering, a brief, almost imperceptible crack in the hard shell he had erected around himself. He slowly lowered the tightly formed fists from the sides of his torso, and for a fleeting moment he had begun to reach out in order to complete the gesture. David's hand remained extended, his posture unwavering, but softened ever so slightly, the slightest indication that maybe he was also not so convinced about the root of what seemed like reconciliation was now playing out before his very eyes. It felt too sudden to trust that the anger would actually cease from that singular motion, almost a setup from the stranger he was staring intently back at. It was also slightly reminiscent of moments spent negotiating the removal of explosives with many dangerous personnel. The energy remained thick between them both, like static that crackled, but only a tiny few degrees away from bursting. An electrical storm brewing quietly before a final destructive explosion was inevitable to arrive. The other store worker had drawn slightly closer. The static of the handheld radio was no longer going. Instead, she slowly removed it and carefully reattached back onto her person. Her presence was a physical manifestation of the watchful eyes and the anticipation that came before disaster. She knew the moment any further action from these men would lead to more severe actions, and the role she may be required to perform. It is something she had often felt in her many long and strenuous working days at Larry's. Each moment as it went by seemed to slowly pull away from that precipice before a fall into disaster had an impact that could damage much more than two patrons. Her presence as someone that tried her best at resolving situations before her also provided another angle of what was happening that made David shift a little from the previous mental loop he was slowly spiraling from. Instead of completing his original intent of giving David's hand a gentle shake, he stopped moving his hands forward. David felt his energy pull slightly back. John, without breaking the gaze still directed into the face of his opposition, now slowly turned back and stepped behind to finally face the rack that caused all of his frustration just moments ago. David could almost detect an almost exhausted energy within that particular action that slowly pushed him back to his starting point. The tension he had earlier quickly began to falter to the same defeated energy of a toddler, whose actions had yielded a negative result, and their energy has quickly been exhausted by them all the same. "You!" John started. The word rasped from the bottom of his throat. He cleared his throat roughly as he then turned slightly at an angle. He used the shelves next to his body as a prop to continue on, slightly leaning as though to brace himself on it so that he didn't fall. His eyes still directed their full stare onto David, who still hadn't moved his posture at all. "You think this will actually end if—" He trailed off for a short second, his attention slightly distracted by some of the tools that he was now almost using to lean upon, as though it was his personal railing for his inner turmoil. He shifted quickly, his focus back on the topic of the issue between him. If people start just reaching their hand like they are trying to make peace when things clearly can't move past. John paused. This time the silence, a strange new experience that seemed to be filled with some type of new reflection on the current circumstance that just played itself out before their eyes. He stared with his face clearly conveying the confusion. Maybe, John continues once again a change that is clear and audible, even with a simple word that sounds heavy with its own hidden meaning that came from it. This change seems sudden, unnatural, almost as it made everyone unsure what direction it will take. He suddenly stood a bit straighter, pulled away from the shelf, as he had now finally seemed to remove that weight, now no longer requiring it to keep upright as before. Maybe it, it has. He struggled to push it through. His chest expanded. An almost deep sound of despair began to fill from within the chest cavities as though something incredibly heavy had began to remove its anchor point, which he was still in the process of slowly and reluctantly trying to detach from. But with it came much struggle to try to push and to force its hand to move into a new place within his emotional core. His arms now had been pulled slowly out by his side, but as they were, he did not close his fists, rather extended outwards his fingers like the start of another open gesture that had been brought forth earlier before the other. It looked like an opening statement from the first confrontation, but almost from the opposite man. David had seen enough conflict to see the vulnerability in John's eyes that had shone slightly in the dim light that the artificial lights of the store created. He allowed for an open moment of waiting to see if the aggression was finally dissipating for what had gone from simple frustration, then aggression, then hate. Now there was something almost new and entirely separate from before, and required his careful observation as to gauge what his final response should be. John suddenly raised his head upward to fixate onto the metal support rails from the tall shelf next to him, before then bringing his eyes directly back into David's. The gaze softened considerably from before, now instead replaced with some other unidentifiable expression. He quickly took an almost sharp gasp, as though he was finally able to finally breathe for the very first time. Something was now fundamentally shifted in some way that made him feel like his inner torment was no longer keeping him in such heavy torment as before. This expression caused David to soften his posture ever so slightly for the first time that entire interaction. He gently relaxed his previously outstretched hand before letting it drift back into place. What were... I was... John began slowly. His head began shaking almost uncontrollably. His arms began wavering by his side, and he now began to appear disheveled. It felt to him and those that were watching as though the internal support holding him so upright, so angry, was almost finally dissolving in front of them, like some type of salt sculpture. He was quickly falling in, melting into a new form that David could understand. I am so tired. His voice lowered drastically, his previous sharp guttural responses now more of a barely there, hushed mumble. I have just wanted peace. The words began to stumble like those of someone exhausted from running for too long on empty and unable to maintain a singular posture, from being overworked for way too long. Every word and movement had shown something. There were traces of hurt, anguish, and most of all pain. He pushed past David, who stepped aside to allow for more space, as the exhausted, now broken stranger slowly drifted his tired bones away from the center of all the issues. David noticed he quickly swiped and grasped at an odd number of items, now paying them off using the machine in a fast, rushed, and uncoordinated motion at the tills, before staggering slightly as he moved away towards the automatic sliding doors, out towards the afternoon sun. He was almost bent over double but continued in slow stride, his shoulders still a solid wall even though the rest of him had already crumbled in. He barely kept looking at the doors of Larry's local. David had now felt that change himself. The rage had slowly dissipated from its place under the skin to leave only a soft but hard lump of tension under where the emotional part of him could place a specific part of him. His breathing slowly returned to normal, but his hands, those previously hardened instruments, had slightly trembled for only a short instance, and then calmed in tandem to the more measured beat of the familiar environment he now found himself in again. He was used to such reactions, but there was something new, something else within this entire interaction that felt more than before, and that troubled him the moment he stopped to allow those to soak in. The worker, visibly sighing quietly now, quickly took up her position. As she pulled at the radio, she spoke once again to the receiver that had been dormant. The call went immediately to a store manager, who also doubled as someone who dealt with difficult or erratic patron behavior within store. A tall, heavy-set man, who was slightly balding, hurried from the direction where David could now faintly remember hearing muffled voices from before, when John made his initial, loud, angry display. He glanced at the employee now moving with haste around the central pillar and gave a curt nod before approaching where David was standing, just to make a mental assessment of the situation. "Did the guy give you trouble, David? Are you okay?" "My team has heard the chatter over radio," he said in his standard, slightly gruff tone. "He always has, but also he added just an extra touch of added kindness just underneath the very bottom surface level. Yes, and I think I'm all right." He gestured over to where John had made his hasty and quite clearly distressed retreat. The shop assistant had begun quickly removing the various odd tools John had left lying around, but still paid the most care into where all his items needed to belong. There was now very little to say about that, now that was unfolding in front of him, so David felt it slightly safe enough to lower his guard further. His breathing finally lowered slowly from any form of agitation. The manager looked around slightly, checking and glancing, and various parts of the shelving sections around that specific area, before then redirecting his attention to David again, who had slowly begun placing items onto a central table near the cashier area. The action of organizing seemed slightly too precise, which hinted towards something still there that needed to resolve before that energy can fully diminish. Just a standard check with what usually goes on, but that level felt like a slightly more extreme situation. "Thanks again, man, and just holler if you ever require something like this." He gave an amicable nod again and a pat onto David's arm before turning around and then walked directly in a slightly slower manner now towards the checkout aisle. The familiar sense of peace and normal slow energy began its return again. But there were small pieces, minute, but they felt as if something larger could still arise. David watched the man leave for a short few seconds. It seemed everything he had experienced in those small few minutes with John, it all happened here, in this small aisle surrounded by garden tools. That it still happened here, and still had a clear mark that David would certainly carry even through the coming days. That in that brief moment, that the most intense hatred he experienced was only done using a few sentences, and then he had just completely folded onto himself just like that, with no extra work involved. A quick and clean ending that seemed almost too perfect, even more so considering his other past encounters were not anything nearly as clear. His thoughts were interrupted by his cellular device ringing directly in his back pocket, which broke him completely free of this internal dialogue he was quietly keeping. "All right," David thought before slowly releasing a long sigh as he picked up his basket. "I'm all done here anyways." He said this to no one, but to every ear that was there present.